Rowan Hale needed $312 for his daughter's prescription, but that night he found himself standing before a $60 million private jet owned by one of the most powerful women in American aviation. 3 engineering teams had already walked away, declaring the repair would take 3 days and cost nearly $200,000. Rowan listened to the engine, caught an anomaly no one else noticed, and asked only for enough money to get his daughter's medicine by morning. 2 hours later, the jet was cleared for takeoff. The following morning, Serafina Whitmore placed a check for $1 million on the table in front of him. If you believe real value has nothing to do with a job title, stay with Rowan's story until the very end. The pharmacy was 3 blocks from Hawthorne County Hospital, tucked between a sandwich shop and a hardware store, the kind of place that knew its regulars by name. Rowan Hale had been coming here every 4 weeks for 2 years, always on a Wednesday afternoon, always for the same orange prescription bottle with Lila's name printed on the label. He was not a man who wasted words or gestures, and the pharmacist on duty had long since stopped asking if he needed a bag. That Wednesday in early winter, though, the transaction stalled before it began. The insurance card Rowan handed across the counter came back with a quiet apology. The coverage had lapsed. The new policy through his maintenance job at Hawthorne Ridge Airport did not activate for another 14 days. And the medication Lila required for her congenital arrhythmia was not something the pharmacy could advance without payment. The total came to $312. Rowan had $87 in checking and a rent payment already cleared that morning. He stood at the counter long enough to confirm that no corner of his wallet would close the gap, thanked the pharmacist without bitterness, and was told the prescription would be held until 9 o'clock the following morning. He had 1 night to find the difference. He considered every option in the 3 minutes he sat in his truck in the parking lot before pulling back onto the road, every person he might call, every account he might draw down, every arrangement that had any chance of producing $312 before morning, and he found the list shorter than he needed it to be. He drove home through a thin sheet of early snow and told Lila that the pharmacy was waiting on a shipment from another location, that her medicine would arrive tomorrow, that everything was fine. She was 10 years old and trusted him entirely, which was precisely why the lie felt so heavy, and which was also why he did not go back to tell her the truth, because explaining the actual situation would have required her to carry something she was not old enough to carry, and that was a line he held without deliberation. He made dinner, checked her homework, sat with her through the first half hour of her favorite nature program, and once she was asleep he put on his work coat, drove back out through the darkening streets, and headed toward the airport. Caleb Dorsey ran the ground maintenance crew at Hawthorne Ridge with a curt efficiency that Rowan had come to respect, and Caleb was still in the break room when Rowan arrived half an hour before his shift. Rowan asked whether any overtime had opened up. Caleb told him the budget for supplemental hours had been frozen since November, then tilted his head toward the south hangar and said something else had come in that might change the picture. A private jet bearing the Whitmore Global insignia had made an emergency landing 2 hours earlier after a persistent fire warning alert in the right engine, and the airport's ground crew had been asked to assist with access and containment while the aircraft's own technical team was summoned. Support time would carry a billable rate. Rowan looked through the break room window at the silver aircraft being towed under the hangar lights. He recognized the white W on the tail from a different era of his life, a version of himself he had spent years putting behind him, and he thought nothing of it beyond the arithmetic of the overtime. He had no way to know that the jet would pull his entire buried history back to the surface before morning. He walked the perimeter of the aircraft as part of his standard ground check and listened during the first engine diagnostic cycle. The warning system fired cleanly at startup, then went quiet, then fired again during a secondary rotation. The two senior technicians on site agreed it was a sensor malfunction in the engine control module and began preparing a parts requisition. Rowan heard something else, a brief, half-second interruption in the warning pulse that did not match the timing of the engine cycle. It was the kind of detail a person missed if they were listening for the big noise instead of the small one, and every experienced technician in that hangar was listening for the big noise. Rowan said nothing yet. He finished his ground check, noted the anomaly in his own memory, and kept working. Whitmore 1 was not merely a corporate aircraft. It was the flagship of a fleet that represented Serafina Whitmore's personal control over a $2 billion aviation enterprise, and on this particular night, its grounding carried consequences that reached far beyond a missed appointment. 3 separate technical teams had joined a remote diagnostic call and arrived at the same conclusion. The engine control assembly needed replacement. The parts would have to be flown in from a certified depot, and the minimum repair window was 72 hours. The cost, including logistics, certified labor, and mandatory recertification, would approach $190,000. Serafina Whitmore had been informed of these figures in the forward cabin of her own aircraft while a Wyoming wind rattled the hangar doors. She heard them the way a person hears a sentence they fully understand but refuse to accept, because the numbers meant she would not be in New York by 9 the following morning, and that absence would cost her something far larger than a repair bill. Victor Langston presented the situation to her with what he called practical clarity, suggesting she arrange a charter flight, pivot to a video link for the morning session, or accept the delay as an unfortunate circumstance beyond her control. He was 52 years old, had worked alongside the Whitmore family for more than 2 decades, and spoke to her in the measured tone of a man who considered himself indispensable. He mentioned twice that the meeting could potentially be rescheduled. What he did not mention was that a group of shareholders aligned with Conrad Ashbourne's Ashbourne Meridian Group had been quietly assembling proxy votes for weeks and were expecting precisely this kind of window: an unexpected absence, an uncontested quorum, a vote cast while the controlling seat was empty. The storm system that had grounded alternate charters at Hawthorne Ridge's short runway was not part of Victor's plan, but it was very much to his benefit. Serafina knew the board dynamics and had known about the accumulating pressure for months. She had built Whitmore Global from a regional charter operation into a vertically integrated aviation enterprise, and the board session in question was not a routine agenda review. It was a vote on whether to divest the engine manufacturing subsidiary that underpinned every long-term contract in the company's portfolio, a sale that would hand Conrad Ashbourne a structural advantage over the Whitmore fleet for the next 15 years. Victor understood this as well as she did, which was precisely why his suggestions leaned so consistently toward options that required her absence. She told him to find another solution and went back to reviewing documents. Rowan, meanwhile, had been watching the second round of diagnostics from across the hangar floor. He noticed that the fire warning alert appeared only when the aircraft's anti-collision lighting system cycled on in conjunction with the wing anti-icing unit. Both systems ran on a shared secondary power bus, and the timing of that coincidence was precise enough to suggest the fault was not inside the engine at all. He walked to Caleb, laid out the observation in 2 sentences, and asked that it be passed along without his name attached. He did not want anyone running a background check while he was trying to earn $312. Caleb relayed the hypothesis to the lead technician on site, who dismissed it on the basis that the man who had noted it was a ground maintenance worker whose highest listed qualification on the airport's records was operation of runway descing equipment. Serafina was standing near the forward stairwell when the exchange happened, close enough to hear the technician's dismissal, and Caleb's flat reply that the person who had noticed it had been right about stranger things. She asked Caleb to bring her the employee who thought he understood her jet. Rowan appeared in front of her in work gear, still carrying traces of the night's snowfall, a tall man with the specific stillness of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as a situation required and no more. Victor Langston stood nearby and made a remark about the wisdom of consulting ground personnel on avionics questions. Serafina did not look at Victor. She told Rowan he had 2 minutes and asked him to explain his reasoning. Rowan said the fire warning circuit was not registering heat from the engine. It was registering a voltage fluctuation in the detection loop itself. When 2 secondary systems drew current simultaneously from the shared bus, a small amount of leakage current entered the detection circuit and caused the control unit to interpret it as a thermal event. The fault was almost certainly located behind the junction panel at the base of the right-wing root where the bus connections for both systems converged. The lead technician interrupted to note that the wing root panel had been serviced at Whitmore's main maintenance facility less than 6 weeks prior. Rowan said that was exactly why it needed to be opened. Serafina authorized the panel removal without further discussion. Behind the panel, they found a bonding wire that had been subject to brief arcing, not severed, not obviously damaged under standard visual inspection, but charred at one splice point in a way that created intermittent resistance under load. The technician confirmed it matched the fault pattern and also confirmed, with some reluctance, that a bonding wire failure alone would not fully account for the signal behavior Rowan had described. Rowan pointed to the connector seated at the junction block and said the underlying cause was more likely a high-resistance connector introducing voltage irregularities into the loop. He was right. Serafina turned to him and asked directly what he needed to complete the repair. Rowan did not ask for a contract, a title, or a fee tied to the value of the aircraft. He asked whether the airport could advance him $312 against his overtime for the evening so he could pay for his daughter's prescription before the pharmacy's 9 o'clock deadline. The hangar went quiet in a particular way. Not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of people recalibrating what they were looking at. Victor's expression moved through several things in rapid succession. Serafina agreed, and Rowan told her plainly that he would not accept the money until the aircraft had passed every safety check on the post-repair sequence. When he removed the suspect connector and held it under the work light to confirm the replacement specification, he saw a manufacturer code stamped on its housing, a code he had last seen in a different state, on a different aircraft, 6 years earlier, during the worst week of his life. Caleb confirmed a certified replacement was available in the airport's emergency parts inventory, still sealed in manufacturer packaging with an intact certification tag. Rowan inspected the serial number, the issue date, and the torque specification before touching it, then began the replacement sequence with the deliberate pace of someone who understood precisely what each step cost if it was done wrong. Serafina watched from a position near the wing root without speaking. She had been in rooms with many technically proficient people over the course of her career, and had learned to distinguish between those who worked quickly because they were confident, and those who worked carefully because they understood consequences. Rowan worked carefully. Victor twice suggested that the warning system's silence following the initial repair was sufficient for departure clearance. Rowan told him the aircraft would not leave the hangar until he had completed 3 full engine cycle tests and reviewed the results against the baseline tolerances for the detection system. During the second test cycle, The warning light pulsed once for less than a second and then held dark. Most observers treated it as residual noise. Rowan stopped the cycle, told the room it was not residual noise, and traced the signal to a second connector in the backup detection loop, one that shared the same housing design, the same manufacturer code, and the same installation date as the first. Two defective connectors, both installed during the same maintenance visit, both creating the same fault under the same conditions. The probability that this represented coincidence was low enough that Rowan stated it plainly to Serafina. Someone had put these here intentionally, or someone had knowingly sourced and installed components that did not meet the specification they were sold under. He replaced the second connector, cleaned both contact points, retensioned the bonding wire, and restarted the test sequence from the beginning. An hour and 40 minutes after Serafina had authorized the panel removal, Whitmore 1 cleared all 3 test cycles without a single anomaly. Caleb signed the maintenance confirmation alongside the airport's duty engineer, and the aircraft was certified for departure. Serafina asked Rowan whether he preferred cash or a bank transfer for the $312. Rowan gave her the pharmacy's payment processing number and asked that the transfer be sent directly, in that exact amount, nothing more. The aircraft taxied out into a wind that had finally eased and lifted off the Hawthorne Ridge runway a little after 2 in the morning. Rowan stood at the edge of the tarmac apron and watched its navigation lights disappear into the overcast, believing the account between himself and Whitmore Global was now closed. Somewhere over Nebraska, Serafina Whitmore opened a file Evelyn Hartwell had compiled during the past 3 hours, and read that Rowan Hale had been, at 31 years old, among the youngest engineers in the country to hold independent certification authority over avionics systems in corporate jet aircraft. She landed in New York with enough time to walk into the boardroom before the session was gavelled to order. The proxy block that had been assembled so carefully over the preceding weeks found its margin thinner than expected. Serafina had spent the 90 minutes before the meeting on the phone, calling 3 undecided board members whose votes Victor had counted as effectively absent. The resolution to divest Whitmore Global's engine manufacturing subsidiary failed to reach quorum, and Serafina retained operational authority over a fleet contract worth $870 million. She returned Evelyn's follow-up call during the car ride back to the airport and asked her to continue pulling on the thread she had found in Rowan's file. By the time Serafina's second aircraft landed back at Hawthorne Ridge the following morning, Evelyn had already identified that the 2 connectors removed from Whitmore 1 carried a supplier code registered to a company called Northstar Component Logistics, and that the same supplier code appeared in the approved vendor records for 3 other aircraft in the Whitmore fleet. Rowan was replacing a burned-out runway edge light when someone from the airport's administrative office told him a visitor was waiting in the VIP reception room. He assumed it was a complaint about the previous night's unauthorized panel work. He went in still carrying his tool bag. Serafina was sitting at the table with Evelyn Hartwell beside her and a single document folder between them. The check she placed in front of Rowan was drawn for $1 million, and Evelyn walked through the structure. $50,000 as a direct payment for the emergency repair and the technical risk assessment it had prevented. $150,000 for an exclusive license to the diagnostic method Rowan had applied, which Evelyn had confirmed was not documented in any Whitmore maintenance protocol. And $800,000 as the fee for a 12-month independent audit of the entire Whitmore corporate fleet, conducted under Rowan's direct authority, with full access to maintenance records and the right to ground any aircraft pending investigation. Rowan looked at the document for a long time, then told her he was not going to sign it. He said it quietly and without hostility. He needed to understand whether the contract was a genuine business arrangement or a way of attaching his name to an outcome that would go wrong, because he had been in that position before. Serafina told him the value of work was not determined by the desperation of the person performing it. He had asked for $312, and that was his choice. But the repair and the risk identification were worth what they were worth, regardless of what he had needed at the moment he made them. Rowan said he would sign under 3 conditions: unrestricted access to all maintenance records going back 5 years, no alteration or suppression of any finding he reported, and immediate grounding of any aircraft he flagged as unsafe without requiring a secondary approval. Serafina agreed to all 3 without negotiating. When Rowan turned the first pages of the North Star file that afternoon, the pattern assembled quickly. 7 aircraft in the Whitmore fleet had received components from the same intermediary distributor, a company registered 14 months prior at the address of a vacant freight warehouse outside Denver. The certifications attached to the components were formatted correctly and carried the right signatures, but the serial number sequences were constructed using a digit grouping that no certified manufacturer used, and the lot stamps under magnification showed inconsistent depth and character spacing. Caleb had been brought in as a witness to the overnight repair and was now assisting the audit as a supporting observer. Evelyn's team pulled the corporate registration for North Star and found that the registered agent was a law firm that had represented 2 companies linked to financial structures associated with Conrad Ashbourne's investment group. Victor Langston attended the first audit session and offered an explanation that was clean and complete and, Rowan noticed, prepared in advance, the kind of explanation that exists before the questions are asked. Victor said the decision to use North Star had been a supply chain cost measure during a period of component shortages, and that every order had been reviewed and approved by the technical department. Rowan looked at the approval signatures on 4 of those orders and said nothing, because the signatures were copies, identical down to the ink pressure artifacts, of a single original scanned from a document signed 2 years earlier. He noted the fact quietly, added it to the working file, and kept the session moving. He had learned long ago that the most useful thing a person could do with a piece of evidence was to secure it before anyone realized it was significant. A second aircraft in the fleet, a mid-size jet used for regional executive travel, was found to have a sensor cluster installed under the same North Star certification that behaved identically to the connectors in Whitmore 1 under icing conditions. If that aircraft had departed into the mountain corridor without inspection, the fault would have been indistinguishable from a standard instrument anomaly until conditions changed. Serafina grounded the entire subfleet covered by the audit without waiting for a second opinion, accepting the schedule disruption and the client relations cost without flinching. The decision required her to notify 4 separate clients that their scheduled flights were suspended pending technical review, to absorb the associated penalties, and to manage the public messaging around what the operations team was carefully describing as a precautionary maintenance hold. She did all of it in the span of 3 hours, and then went back to reviewing the audit findings. Rowan noted the decision and what it meant. She had the information and she acted on it immediately. He had worked for people who did not do that, and he knew the difference it made when a single day's decision separated an incident from something that could not be undone. Late in the second afternoon, while cross-referencing the financial routing on the North Star payments, Rowan found a transaction code he recognized, an account identifier that had appeared in billing documents during a completely different chapter of his professional life, at a company called Aldercrest Dynamics. 6 years earlier, Rowan had been a senior avionics engineer at Aldercrest Dynamics. one of the smaller but technically respected firms in the corporate jet system space. He had been assigned to a development program for a new electronic architecture, and partway through that program, he had found evidence that a procurement manager was systematically substituting specification-grade components with visually identical but electrically inferior parts sourced through an off-books arrangement. He compiled a report, routed it through proper internal channels, and waited. The report did not move. A test aircraft experienced a partial system failure during a high-altitude evaluation flight and made an emergency descent. Nobody was injured. The internal investigation that followed produced a finding that named Rowan as the engineer who had independently altered component specifications without authorization, a conclusion built on a document trail assembled after the fact using his digital credentials and a record of approvals he had never made. Victor Langston had been serving as an operations consultant to Aldercrest at that time. He had signed the summary report that concluded Rowan had acted unilaterally, and he had done it knowing the underlying documents were fabricated. There had been a moment in the weeks that followed the report's publication when Rowan had believed the truth would surface on its own, that someone else at Aldercrest would recognize the inconsistencies in the timeline, that the procurement records would eventually be pulled and compared, that the gap between what he had actually done and what the investigation claimed would become impossible to ignore. It did not happen. The people with the authority to look chose not to, and the people who suspected the truth had their own reasons for staying quiet. Rowan had not had the financial resources to mount a sustained legal challenge, and his wife had been diagnosed with the illness that would eventually take her. And he had made the calculation that the people who came after him would be better equipped to fight than he was at that moment. He had moved to Wyoming, taken a job that asked nothing of him but competence and punctuality, and built something small and stable for Lila. He was sitting in a conference room at Whitmore Global's Western Operations Center when his phone rang and Lila's name appeared on the screen. He stepped out to take the call. She told him the medicine had arrived and asked whether he had actually fixed the big airplane he had mentioned the night before. He said he had helped it find its way home. She said that sounded like something he would say. He told her he would be back by dinner and ended the call. Serafina had heard the last few seconds from the doorway. She did not intervene. Later, when they were reviewing the North Star payment trail, she asked him why he had not simply taken the money and walked away from all of it. He told her that if he left, the next person who found a defective component might not catch it before the aircraft was already airborne. She held that thought without responding. What developed between them over the following days was not warmth in any sentimental sense. It was something more specific, the particular regard that forms between two people who have each been stripped of something important and have chosen, independently, to build on what remained. The warning came from a junior analyst inside the audit process who had noticed Victor spending unusual time near a records server room 2 floors below the main offices and had passed the observation to Rowan through a personal channel. Rowan forwarded it to Evelyn. By the time they reached the records room, a portion of the North Star transaction files had already been flagged for archival purge, and 3 physical component boxes had been removed from a locked inspection cabinet. The weight discrepancy on the freight manifest for the building's loading dock that afternoon did not match any logged outbound shipment, and the delivery address on the unsigned routing slip matched a private hangar facility registered to a holding company that Evelyn had already connected to Conrad Ashbourne's asset network. Rowan and Evelyn documented everything, photographed the manifest, and placed a single call to the Federal Aviation Safety Authority's field office. They did not follow the truck. They compiled the record and waited for the legal process to move at its own pace, which it did, with a search warrant executed at the private hangar within 36 hours. Among the documents recovered in that search was a planning file that laid out, in methodical operational detail, the sequence of events intended to unfold on the night Whitmore 1 had landed at Hawthorne Ridge. The file described the selection of Northstar components, their placement in the aircraft during a scheduled maintenance visit, the expected failure mode under cold weather conditions, and the estimated delay that the resulting grounding would impose on Serafina's travel schedule. The estimated window was 14 to 18 hours, calculated to be sufficient for the proxy vote to proceed without her. There was a contingency section covering the backup aircraft, which had also received Northstar components, confirming the operation had been designed with redundancy. The metadata embedded in the file's revision history pointed to a user account registered to a server inside Ashbourne Meridian's IT infrastructure. Serafina wanted the full picture made public immediately. Rowan advised patience, announcing prematurely would give Victor time to construct an alternative explanation with enough surface plausibility to muddy the legal record, and Victor had not yet moved whatever he intended to move next. The mechanism they chose was a formal internal notice stating that Serafina would be using the backup aircraft for the next board session. Within 6 hours of that notice, a remote firmware update was pushed to the backup aircraft's flight management system from a service account registered under Victor's credentials, unscheduled, unapproved, undisclosed to the maintenance team. The update was not subtle. It targeted the same class of system that the Northstar components had been designed to compromise, and it would have created a fault condition severe enough to ground the aircraft within the first 30 minutes of flight. The aircraft's own diagnostics logged it automatically, and the log was forwarded to the investigative authority before Victor could access the system to remove it. That same evening, Victor appeared at the hangar facility and offered at length to arrange a video conference, citing weather concerns. Serafina thanked him and boarded an aircraft Rowan had personally inspected that afternoon. The emergency board session convened at Whitmore Global's New York headquarters 2 days later. Victor arrived with documentation framing the $1 million contract as evidence of financial mismanagement, a payment to a man with a damaged professional record made without board review, under circumstances that he characterized as emotionally manipulated rather than commercially evaluated. Rowan was brought into the boardroom not to defend himself, but to walk the board through the technical record in the sequence it had actually occurred. The initial fault identification, the connector analysis, the Northstar sourcing chain, the forged approval signatures in 4 sequential purchase orders, the firmware update issued from Victor's service account, and the financial connection between that account structure and the web of transactions that had funded the Northstar distribution network going back through the Aldercrest episode 6 years prior. He presented it without oratory and without asking the board to take anything on trust. The board members who had arrived expecting a personal dispute between 2 executives found themselves looking instead at a methodical technical and financial record built across 12 days by a team that had started with a defective connector the size of a thumb and followed its provenance across 6 years of deliberately obscured documentation. Caleb confirmed the repair sequence from start to finish. Evelyn presented the financial data and the communications metadata. A former Aldercrest engineer located by Evelyn's team 2 days prior had provided a written statement describing a direct conversation in which Victor had asked him to remove Rowan's internal complaint report from the company's compliance file. Conrad Ashbourne denied any involvement in the Northstar network, presenting himself as a passive investor misled by subordinates. The payment routing that connected his investment structures to Northstar's operating account told a more specific story, One, the forensic accountants retained by the federal authority were already well into the process of reading. Victor turned to a final claim that Serafina had orchestrated the investigation to protect her own authority. Serafina responded by telling the board she was not asking them to take her word for anything. She was asking them to read the documents on the table in front of them, which carried Victor's own signatures, Victor's own user account logs, and Victor's own revision history in the metadata of a planning file recovered from a facility connected to his co-conspirator. The board had not yet called for a vote when federal investigators arrived in the hallway with an order compelling the production of records held by Whitmore Global's compliance and vendor management offices. The session was suspended. It did not need to reconvene to resolve the question of who had been telling the truth. Victor Langston was removed from all positions and faced investigation into commercial fraud, falsification of technical certifications, and conspiracy to manipulate a public company. Conrad Ashbourne's firm was placed under regulatory review regarding payments to entities connected to the Northstar network, effectively ending his pursuit of any Whitmore asset. Neither man's downfall arrived through a dramatic confrontation. It came through the accumulation of documentation, through legal orders, through the simple and unspectacular fact that the records they had tried to alter still existed and could be read by people with the authority to act on them. The board voted to retain Serafina in her role and authorized a full reconstruction of the fleet maintenance oversight system. The independent report examining the Aldercrest incident of 6 years prior concluded that the documentation used to assign responsibility to Rowan had been constructed after the fact, and that the contemporaneous record, including the complaint he had filed and the component analysis he had attached, was consistent in every detail with the account of an engineer who had been deliberately misrepresented. Serafina issued a public statement describing the $1 million contract as a commercial arrangement reflecting assessed value. The cost of an unnecessary engine replacement avoided, a fleet-wide component integrity failure identified, aircraft valued collectively in the hundreds of millions protected, a corporate governance fraud prevented, and the continued safety of flight crew and passengers ensured. Rowan used a portion of the contract payment to clear the remaining debt that had accumulated across the years of reduced income, to establish a long-term treatment fund for Lila's cardiac monitoring, and to purchase a small maintenance and inspection facility near the Hawthorne Ridge Airport property line. 3 service bays, a parts room, and enough equipment to handle regional turboprop and light jet work. He did not become wealthy in the way that changes a person's posture or their expectations of the world. What changed was simpler and more durable. He no longer had to lower his eyes when his past was brought into a room. The professional record that had been used against him for 6 years was now publicly documented as a fabrication, and the people who had maintained the blacklist, the operations managers and hiring directors at the large firms who had passed his name over in silence, never disclosing their actual reasoning, had no further pretext to hold. Serafina offered him a formal role as independent director of fleet safety for Whitmore Global, reporting directly to the board, with authority to initiate groundings without requiring operational approval. He accepted on the condition that any certified technician on the Whitmore maintenance staff would have the protected right to raise a safety concern and halt a departure without fear of professional retaliation. Serafina agreed and asked Evelyn to put it in writing. 6 months later, Rowan's facility had become the primary independent inspection point for 3 regional airports operating in mountain terrain across Wyoming and Colorado. Caleb had joined as operations manager, trading his position at Hawthorne Ridge for work he described simply as more honest. Several technicians who had been dismissed from larger facilities after filing safety reports found that Rowan had a standing policy of considering their applications first. He did not make speeches about it. He simply structured the hiring process so that a person's history of raising a concern was treated as a qualification rather than a liability. The work itself was not glamorous. It was cold mornings, careful records, and the particular satisfaction of knowing that the aircraft departing the runway had been checked by someone who was paying full attention. The facility had a reputation for being slow in the way that mattered, meaning nothing was signed off before it was ready, and for being fast in the way that mattered more, meaning the findings were accurate and the turnaround predictable. Lila came with her father on the morning the facility opened, standing beside him in the cold with her hands in her jacket pockets and asking questions about every aircraft on the ramp. Her arrhythmia was stable, her medication consistent, and the monthly calculation Rowan had made for 2 years, which bill to defer, whether the prescription gap would somehow close, had stopped being the organizing arithmetic of his life. On the wall of his office, behind the desk and to the left of the window that faced the runway, Rowan had framed 2 things. One was the pharmacy receipt for $312, printed on thermal paper that had already begun to fade at the edges. The other was not the check for $1 million. It was the connector. The first one, the defective one, the one with the manufacturer code that had led him back through 6 years of silence to the night. Someone had tried to bury him inside a falsified file. The federal authority had returned it to him after the investigation closed, accompanied by a brief administrative note confirming it had served its evidentiary purpose and was no longer required by the case record. He had placed it in the frame without ceremony, hung it on the wall next to the receipt, and had not explained it to anyone who visited the office. It did not require explanation. It reminded him of the narrowest point of the story. Not the mechanical failure, not the criminal conspiracy, but the quieter collapse that had been one exhausted decision away. The moment when circumstances had nearly convinced him that his understanding of his own worth should be measured by what he could not afford. Serafina arrived on a Thursday morning in Whitmore 1. The aircraft now carrying a full service record Rowan had reviewed and signed at each scheduled interval. She walked the hangar before she said anything else, looking at the equipment, the organization of the parts room, the status board showing current maintenance progress for each aircraft in the queue. The hangar had the quality of a place where standards were upheld because the people in it believed in them, not because an inspection was scheduled. She recognized that quality because she had seen its absence in the Whitmore facilities that had processed the North Star components, in the maintenance records that had been altered, in every place where the gap between written procedure and actual practice had been allowed to widen without consequence. Then she sat in Rowan's office and asked why he still kept the receipt when there was no longer any shortage it represented. He told her it was there to remind him of one specific night when he had come very close to letting the weight of his circumstances persuade him that what he knew and what he could do were worth less than the amount he owed. She was quiet for a moment and then said that before that night she had spent most of her professional life evaluating people through the lens of their titles and the speed at which they could resolve a problem she had already decided mattered. She said the person who held the lowest-paying job in that hangar had been the only one present who understood what was actually wrong with her aircraft, and that she had not fully appreciated what that meant until she had spent 6 months watching him build something from a single correct decision made on a cold night for a reason that had nothing to do with ambition. She invited him to take the first evaluation flight of the newly certified fleet configuration, a 4-hour circuit over the Rocky Mountain corridor that would serve as the baseline for all future monitoring data. He agreed after he had reviewed the maintenance log himself. Before he climbed the boarding stairs, his phone showed a message from Lila reminding him to be home before dinner because she had made the grocery list and expected him to cook. He smiled at that, put the phone in his jacket, and walked up into the aircraft. Whitmore 1 lifted off the Hawthorne Ridge runway in clear winter air and banked southwest over the ridgeline, carrying the man who had once stood at a pharmacy counter 32 hours short of a prescription payment, and found, before the night was over, that there was no version of desperation large enough to make him forget what he actually knew, and that the world, given enough time and the right evidence, had not entirely forgotten it either.